Hello, everyone. I just wanted to jump on here and wrap up I Will Find You on Netflix. And I have to say, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Enjoyed it to the point I will most likely be going and reading the novel that is the brainchild for the series. So, in episode 4, we kind of begin starting to peel back layers and get more answers. For instance, like where was Cheryl? Apologies, the night that David supposedly murdered Matthew, their son. And we find out that she was told that there was a accident, but it was eventually rerouted. But by the time she had arrived, she was already there. And the doctor who had told her that there was an accident was actually now her current husband, who she is having a child with. And then there also is a flashback. So they show an adoption agency, and a little boy 5 years earlier was being introduced to where he would be staying and his caretakers, and told that he be safe wherever and whatever ends up happening with him and his case and rehoming him. But somehow that child ends up going missing. And at the end of episode 3, Lenny, David's dad, goes missing. Well, someone puts a gun to his head. And then in episode 4, he was supposed to show up for chemo, and his daughter, Sophie, David's sister, is worried that he's missing, but she's not going to say anything to the cops because obviously their family is a hot target at the moment. So we have that going on, and Sophie eventually getting questioned and grilled by the police. And this episode, and I think episode 5, really started to leak Cheryl's secrets. So I was really shocked by some of the things I found out in the concurrent episodes later in the series. Now, David and Rachel are starting to put the pieces together, and they are starting to realize that Nikki Fisher has something to do with Matthew's disappearance, and they're going to try to go get answers. And they end up going to Nikki Fisher's daughter's house. Well, David does. And he ends up holding her at gunpoint and tells her to call her father. And then there's a whole standoff situation where David's like, I really need to speak to him. And he's about to be unalive. But Nikki Fisher makes the call and tells him to come meet him. And by all accounts, I'm like, this is over. He's messed with a big boss, and he's getting ready to, as they say, wear cement shoes or go swim with the fishies or something. But he ends up getting on an airplane, and he is routed to almost like a knockoff Coney Island. And we find out that he built this almost as a in memoriam of his son who was murdered in prison. And then more secrets start coming out, and we start getting to the end of episode 4 and into episode 5, and we find out that Lenny, David's dad, and the prison guard that's been protecting David while they're in prison, they actually planted evidence. Now, Nikki Fisher's son did actually kill somebody in a fight, but he had already set the system up to where his son wouldn't have to face any consequences, and it was about to be go awash. Well, then they decided to or to produce evidence to get him incarcerated, and he was murdered in prison. So then there was a hit put out on Lenny and his prison guard, who's been watching over him. Well, it's one big circle, so please bear with me. So, as a way to stop the hit and no one getting killed, his friend Adam, who is the police officer who was acting sketchy in the beginning, and I was wondering what was the deal, but he actually was doing it to watch out for David. He told Fisher that he would be his inside of the police department and get him all the information and leaks that he needed if he would take away the hit. So that closed the loop on something. But then we have this standoff where Fisher tells David that he has to either shoot his dad or he's not going to find out where Matthew is. So we think we like know what happened to Matthew at this point, and it's a big standoff. Lenny just says, "Just kill me. I'm dying of cancer anyway," which he was. and he can't do it. But all of this was a test because Fisher wanted to see if they were telling the truth, if David really did kill his son. And David would ultimately be willing to kill his dad, I believe, to find his son. And at the end, we leave that scene where he says that Fisher says, I don't kidnap kids. So we're like, dang it. So no, it was a red herring. He is not the person that kidnapped Matthew. In episode 5, David returns back from flying and he is in a standoff with the police, and Williams ends up getting shot. And we end up seeing a little bit more of Gertrude, Hayden's mom. We haven't quite figured out what her part in all of this is, but she's starting to become an intricate part of it. And Hayden, again, for backstory, is Rachel's ex-boyfriend. And Gertrude is not a fan of Rachel, so she does not like her at all. And she wants him to stop making concessions to her to try to help her to prove David's innocence. So she has a handler who is doing her bidding to try to keep Rachel and Hayden apart, but it's not working because Hayden is just absolutely in love with Rachel. Williams is in the hospital, but he ends up being safe and surviving his gunshot. Um, and then Cheryl, we are trying to get another DNA test at this point to prove if the child that they said was Matthews is his, but they're like, how are we going to prove it against anything? Or what do we have? Because David's on the run. Cheryl is the only parent that they can find, but she produces a lock of Matthew's hair for comparison for the blood, because they still have Matthew's blood on file for, and when I say blood, I'm going to do air quotes, a little foreshadowing, blood that's on file. So to kind of move ahead, we end up finding out that this is a system-wide corruption issue, and that DNA tests have been manipulated to try to make it seem like the child that they said was Matthew at the who had the autopsy done, but it's really not Matthew. So I'm just going to go ahead and give that spoiler just ahead to kind of, I guess, close another loop. But we do also find out that Cheryl went to a fertility clinic and she did try to go under insemination, but she was pregnant before the insemination could work. So another loop. David and Cheryl are Matthew's parents, but there's definitely a lot of questions and push and pull the last episodes on if he was the father or not, but we do get confirmation that David is Matthew's father. But I love the part where he talks about being a parent and that no matter what, Matthew was his son. All of this was worth it because it's worth proving his innocence. And then another red herring, I'm just going to say it because it threw me for a loop, is there's a doctor. So let's rewind. Hayden's family is very wealthy and they own a lot of different companies and buildings and different, just a variant of different types of businesses. Well, there's a fertility clinic that they owned or that was in their building, so they never really clarify that. And we find out Cheryl, that was the clinic that she went to. On top of that, we find out that there's a Dr. Jacob Heller who was fired for using his specimens to inseminate and impregnate clients. And there's a whole legal cover up. He was asked to quietly leave, contracts and payoffs were made. And when Hayden and Rachel and David break into the clinic to try to get Cheryl's record, it is gone. So we think like the ultimate cover up here, but it will come back later on. And the curb that was thrown when we find out why is absolutely crazy. Now, a Swiss detective has been trying to find this little boy that went missing because we come to find out he had an illness that would ultimately end up taking his life. So he needs to know what happened to that child that went missing. So not everything's kind of coming together. All the loose ends are starting to fit, all the puzzle pieces are starting to come together. Now, we end up with Rachel and David having pretty much bribing Cheryl's husband, who is the administrator of the hospital, to help them get in because they need to talk to Dr. Heller because they know at this point, like things are starting to get hot. He's going to run away. So they try to break into the hospital, and her husband is like the master of like manipulation because one of the surgery schedulers corners him when he gets Rachel and David into the hospital. And she asks him, like, what are you doing? And he makes up this huge, like, quick on your toes story about, oh, I'm showing reps around because we're going to update and we're going to do this. So I wanted them to see the layouts. I thought that was really smart thinking on their toes. And Greer is starting to figure out what is going on because she's saw the picture and she needs to know if that's Matthew because like she's super smart. She put it together like, okay, this is what's going on. This is not really David trying to escape because if he wanted to escape, he would have escaped prison and ran to Mexico, but he is trying to figure out something and now she wants to figure it out too. But she has been fired. Williams is in the hospital. She is running her section of the section, apologies, of the FBI with technically without authority to do so, but she doesn't care, and that makes me love her even more. She is going to solve this case. So she ends up arresting Cheryl's husband because she thinks he's up to something too, as we did for so long. And he is ultimately trying to help, but everything ends up making sense in the end. So when Rachel, Cheryl, and David are talking, Cheryl and Rachel end up discussing the going to get the records, and they figure out because Cheryl says, I didn't use my name, I used your name, her sister Rachel's name. It's like, what the heck is going on? This is just getting crazier and crazier by the minute. So Cheryl or Rachel has requested the photos of, so let me backtrack because I did leave that part out. Apologies. The pictures that we have that look like the older version of Matthew are from a party from a Six Flags that was rented out by a corporation. Guess whose family is or has to do with the corporation that rented out the Six Flags? Hayden's family. So Rachel asked for a printout of all the missing photographs, and she ends up getting her hands on it. At the same time, Cheryl is trying to correct the DNA question because she ends up having somebody do another DNA test with the right DNA, and it ends up that that child that is in the morgue, that is not Matthew. Okay. So by process of elimination, and we do get confirmation, that little boy from the orphanage is the boy that they used as the fake Matthew, and that Rachel, the only reason why Cheryl put Rachel down as a person who is going to have the procedure is because she didn't want David to find out. But come to find out that Hayden's sister-in-law worked at the clinic and saw Rachel's name on the patient schedule and told Hayden about what was going on. So Hayden asked for his specimen to be used to inseminate who he thought was Rachel at the time. Well, this is when it hits the fan and stuff's going crazy. So this Swiss investigator goes to Gertrude's house because he wants to find out a couple of things because there have been payments to the prison guard that was in the first two episodes that ended up ultimately taking his own life. He had been receiving $1,000 of a monthly payment from a account in the Cayman Islands that happened to have the same initials as Gertrude's father. So everybody's starting to knit the pieces and get it together. And Gertrude, pretty much, she's very good at blowing people off and trying to sweep things under the rug. We have an earlier scene where the Dr. Heller brings a piece of paper to her and she threatens him, and I felt threatened. I felt like if I get out of line, Gertrude's going to mess me up. So I can only imagine how Dr. Heller felt. And she burns the paper. So the Swiss investigator leaves Gertrude and Hayden's home, and Hayden follows him outside, and then he literally a switch is flipped, and he takes a rock and he beats this man to death. And at the same time, we realize in the picture, so some of the pictures, it looks like there's somebody on the other side of Matthew. It's Hayden. Guess who kidnapped Matthew? Hayden. So 1/4 of July, when Rachel and Hayden were broken up for a while and they decided to just hang out for the holiday, Hayden comes to the 4th of July with the family and he meets Matthew and falls in love. But at this point, he had figured out two things. Cheryl was inseminated. So what he thought was Cheryl, or not thought, Cheryl was inseminated, but the baby was David and Cheryl's son, not Cheryl and Hayden's son. But Hayden had gotten in his mind that that was his child and he wanted him. So he kidnapped Matthew, set David up to look like he had murdered him. So obviously there'd be no parental interference because he thought that he was going to impregnate Rachel and it didn't happen. Now, Gertrude, on top of that, made it even worse by letting him believe that biologically he was Matthew's son. So they have been raising this boy for 5 years and no one has been none the wise. And this is when it starts all to crack. So David convinces Greer, like, I need to go get my son. This is the last chance because with all the money that they have, they definitely would have been a flight risk. They would have flown abroad and Matthew would never have been seen again. So I get the logic. Williams is working from the hospital, gunshot wound and all, and gives the FBI director the read of the century and tells her she better activate all the troops and get them to their estate to help David and Greer get out of the situation they're in because the security guards are definitely trying to do what they do, remove them from the premises. So they end up getting into the house. They end up confronting Gertrude and Hayden. And then there's the showdown and there's some gunfire back and forth, back and forth. Hayden ends up confronting his mom about lying about Matthew's paternity, and he ends up shooting his mom. He fully snaps. And then it ends up with the showdown in the woods. And then David is shot and Hayden is unalived. Then we fast forward, and Lenny has unfortunately passed away, and everyone's at their funeral. And it looks like, by all accounts, that they are a blended family at this point because Cheryl has had her baby. They have custody of Matthew. Everybody's getting along. I felt something starting to bloom between Rachel and David. So I'm interested, or I wish I would have gotten more of a happy ending or a loop closure on that, but it's a limited series. You're only going to get what you get. Greer ends up becoming the her dad in her dad's position and he ends up retiring because you see him in the office swarming around asking her if he can help her with cases, and we end up getting a happy ending. Matthew ends up being found and David is exonerated for his murder, and it I thought it was very well written. My only thing that I thought was kind of like, and I guess you can't really answer it and everything's not going to be perfect, but the part about Matthew's birthmark, and he still had the birthmark. So how did Hayden think, like, if Lord forbid someday Rachel would have woken up and said, I want to be with you, how are you going to explain a child that you had that has the exact same birthmark as your murdered nephew? So that was the only like thing that was like, the math didn't math for me. But other than that, I thought it was really good. I think that if you are looking for something to watch in a day, it's 8 episodes, so it'd be a good like lazy day watch. And yeah, that's all I got. So you all have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Bye.